When you think about the Pope, you likely imagine some old man, the Pope-mobile, the altar boy dungeons. But what if I told you popes used to be wild? I'm talking about degenerate teenagers, strip clubs, murder, bribes, and digging up the corpses of your enemies. Today we will be examining what I like to call the cool popes. Just look at this dude, he's a menace. When Pope Stephen rose to power, he had a bit of a grudge against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. There was actually another pope between Stephen and Formosus, but that guy only lasted 15 days and then died mysteriously. So what did Stephen do when he came to power? Did he turn the other cheek and forgive like Jesus teaches us? Nah. He had Formosus' rotting corpse dug up, dressed in his papal robes, and then put on trial. The now well-dressed, decomposing body was placed on a throne and the charges were read aloud. Unsurprisingly, the dead pope did not convey a very convincing defense and was found guilty on all charges. His corpse was stripped of its robes, 3 of its fingers were cut off, and the body was then dressed in peasants' clothing and buried in a graveyard for foreigners. With this out of the way, Stephen could finally relax. He dug him up again. If I had $1 for every time this pope's body was dug up, I'd have $2, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. After the body was exhumed for the second time, it was then thrown into the Tiber. This backfired a bit when the body washed up on the banks of the river and was discovered. Riots broke out all over Rome. Stephen, the mad lad himself, was thrown in jail and then strangled to death. I do have to mention here, the records vary a bit. Some say that immediately after the trial, the body was dragged through the streets and then thrown directly into the Tiber. There was no second burial. Either way, nasty fellow, that Pope Stephen. Who is that obnoxious YouTuber kid that everyone hates? What's his name? Imagine Jack Doherty as Pope, and that's pretty close to John XII. John ascended to the papacy not due to his extreme competence, but rather because of nepotism. You see, John was a prince. His father was the ruler of Rome at the time, and when the Pope died, he installed his son into that position. Records vary, but it's generally accepted that John was around 18 years old when this happened. Young John is now serving dual roles. He's the Prince of Rome, but also the head of the Catholic religion now. He seemed to find the role of prince much more engaging because he quickly turned the Vatican into a brothel casino.
I'm gonna go build my own theme park with blackjack and hookers.
Unpopular opinion, but I would argue that he actually did everyone a favor. Imagine if you could go to church, gamble, and procure women all in the same building. Like, that's a hell of a Sunday morning. People at the time did not share my opinion and were quite upset by the philandering potentate.
I order you to be quiet.
John continued hosting orgies, gambling away the church's money, and even blessing wine with toasts to Satan. His downfall only began when he betrayed King Otto I of Germany. Europe is a bit of a mess in this whole period. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe essentially entered a 500-year-long episode of Game of Thrones. So when Pope John was having some trouble with other Italians, he called the King of the Germans for help.
Pathetic.
Otto comes down from Germany, he kicks some Italian ass, and then he goes to visit our friend Pope John in Rome. Otto was ordained, that's really hard to say. Otto was ordained emperor as a reward, and then he left Rome again. Pope John, who had learned nothing from this whole ordeal, immediately started plotting against Otto. This blew up in his face a bit when Otto caught wind of the plan, returned to Rome, and deposed John from the papacy. A few of the charges leveled against Pope John are worth mentioning. Praying to demons for luck when gambling, pretty cool. Fornicating with his niece, not great. Castrating his enemies, that's just mean. And my favorite, sleeping with his father's concubine. Anyways, shortly after his ousting, the young ex-pope died. He was only around 30 years old. Weep not for Pope John though. He died doing what he loved. Famously, John was in bed with a noblewoman when her husband returned home. Her husband then murdered Pope John in a fit of rage. Alexander VI, better known as... You get it? Pope? Godfather is pretty good. No, this guy was actually a mobster though. Alexander comes from the Borgia family. I'm pronouncing all these wrong, so just forgive me, okay? I'm sorry. A clan notorious for corruption, poisonings, and their love of the ladies. Even more surprisingly, Alexander VI was a Spaniard. Not a lot of Spanish popes in the church's history, but Alex was willing to use tools most were not to secure the position. He spent his early years as the vice-chancellor of the church, which sounds meaningless until you realize he was essentially in charge of the church's checkbook. He dispensed money and favors for decades with the classic Godfather strings attached. The election of a new pope was called in 1492, and it was now time to call in all the favors. With the support of his indebted friends, a few murders, and a couple of $1 million in bribes, Alexander VI was named Pope. And I can hear you now. Murder, bribery, that's so boring. Be patient, it gets better, all right, relax. He had many affairs and produced many children out of wedlock. When he rose to power, he made sure those illegitimate children had stations of high office. One of his children, Cesare, became a warlord later in life. Famously, he invited some of his rebellious captains to a meeting where he said he would forgive them and then had them all strangled to death. Machiavelli, yes, that Machiavelli, was so impressed by this ruthless example of realpolitik, he included this maneuver in his book called The Prince. And this isn't even in the script, but The Prince is like mandatory reading for all young men. That and The Fountainhead, just do it. But we're not here to talk about Alex's kids. We're here to talk about a house party so legendary that I'm making a YouTube video about it 500 years later. This party was arranged by Pope Alex's son for the Pope and his closest friends. The main event of the evening, 50 escorts and a barrel of chestnuts. While the men dined and drank, the girls were encouraged to strip naked and dance on the tables for entertainment. Can we just take a moment here to appreciate that society has not changed at all? Like, sure, we have iPhones and antidepressants now, but your bachelor party weekend in Tijuana was probably almost identical to the Vatican in 1501. Eventually, the chestnuts were scattered on the floor and the naked girls crawled around on their hands and knees collecting them. And just a reminder, this is happening in the Pope's house in the Vatican. I cannot stress this enough. When they got bored of watching that, Pope Alex started offering rewards of gold and fine jewels for the man who could, bed the most women during that evening. Bed is actually a poor choice of words because there were no beds involved. The guests tangled with these fine ladies on the tables in the dining hall. And the consequences for this debauched night? Nothing. Pope Alex had secured so much influence and power that nobody dared criticize him publicly. He remained Pope until his death at age 71. Some say it was poison, and most likely it was malaria or a fever. So what did we learn, class? That's right. The key to a long, happy life is crime and lots of prostitutes. There's a few more on my list here, but how do you follow up the chestnut party? I do have to mention Pope Leo X though before we go. Pope Leo liked to party. Are you noticing a pattern yet? Less escorts and more just really fancy parties. So fancy that he essentially bankrupted the church. In order to fix the church's financial situation and to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, Leo ramped up the selling of indulgences. If you're not familiar, an indulgence is basically a way to buy your way out of hell. You do something bad, you give the church some money, everything's cool, all is forgiven. This blatant corruption inspired Martin Luther to produce his 95 Thesis and nail it to the church door in Wittenberg. You know, I've actually been to that church, it's pretty amazing. Martin Luther's objections to Catholicism kicked off the Protestant Reformation, which eventually split Christianity in two. Today, there are over 900 million Protestants, and it's still the majority religion in the United States. All this because Pope Leo liked having really fancy parties.